Thank you. I'm going to start with a video. So I mentioned before the story of Ruel. Well, I actually did get a video of Ruel sharing his own story. And so I thought there's a bit of a review that you would be able to watch it. And I want you to listen and hear him talk about moving through the process. It's not just Ruel, though. It's also Jess. So Ruel, as I said, 4.5 years ago, arrived on campus as a non-Christian, and he was our student president last year. Jess arrived on campus 3.5 years ago, and she's our student president this year. And so you'll hear her story. One of the things that excites me about Jess is that she found out a week or so ago that all her classes last Tuesday were cancelled. And so rather than stay at home, she lives in Cherrybrook, rather than stay at home, she came into campus for the day on Tuesday at Sydney Uni. And she arranged with her friends to meet up with a different person each hour. And she went out and was trying to approach strangers and talk about sharing her faith with people. So when you hear her story, hopefully you'll appreciate the transformation God's taken her through as well.
Hi, I'm Ruel. So I'm studying Science and Arts at Sydney Uni, and I'm the president for Power to Change. Yeah, well, my first experience with Power to Change was actually before I went to uni, and I was on a hitchhiking trip up to the Gold Coast and back. And on one of my stops, I ended up bumping into a schoolies mission for Power to Change. And long story short, they were nice enough to let me stay with them in their accommodation, and I spent 3 days, I guess, being alongside them and getting to know them, and that was kind of my first experience of Power to Change.
I'm Jessica, and I study vet science at Sydney Uni.
How far through your degree are you?
I am at year 3, and I'm halfway there.
Cool. And how did you meet Power to Change?
So Power to Change has these summer project missions every year, and I had just graduated high school, and I was just having a holiday at the same location that they had their mission, and they found me there. A girl called Minji, and she just talked to me and told me about Power to Change on campus.
Yeah, so I guess when I first met them, I wasn't a Christian, and I kind of was really full in my own ideas, and kind of felt like I was on the path that I wanted to know. Like, it was all about meditation and self-improvement and adventure. And we kind of just parted ways, and I continued my hitchhiking trip. But I think, they did try to share the gospel to me a couple of times, and I had my own response. But I think they were such nice people that, they mentioned that there was a Power to Change on the uni I was going to go to, and so I decided to check it out when I started this year.
Yeah, so I went to the orientation week, found their stall, did a survey, and said that I was interested in learning about Christianity. And then they introduced me into this short 6-week course called Christianity Explained. And so I did that with Minji, and it was really good to cover the foundations of the gospel.
What was your spiritual background before you arrived on campus?
So before I arrived on campus, I had no belief. I halfway between atheist and agnostic.
Yeah, so I went up to the stall in a week, and I just put my name down, and then a couple of days later, one of the staff called me.
Who was?
Billy.
Yeah.
So Billy, called me, and we ended up meeting one-on-one, and we went through Christianity Explained, or we went through Mark's Gospel. And I think in those times, God was really sort of moving in my heart and kind of humbling me, and I guess showing my need for Him and the reality of where I was. And so I think it was through meeting up with Billy, and also through a friend who was invited me to church, that I came to know Jesus in my first year of small groups, weekly meetings, being discipled by Him, and I guess growing in ministry skills and in general. And I think probably a big thing was doing salt hours, which was times of outreach and evangelism to people around campus.
Then I got connected to a church. I started getting involved in Power to Change. I became a student leader, which is really cool. I started learning the grounds of my faith, but also how to share my faith, which is really scary at first. But now, I've been part of like core groups, which is like a small Bible study group that we have on campus. I've been leading that for a couple semesters now, and yeah, I've been seeing people who've come to my core group that don't know Jesus, and I've been seeing them like progress and put their faith in Jesus. Or I've seen like people still new in their faith and then learning to share their faith. Like I've just been seeing the growth of people.
Did you find it easy to follow the process? That's right. I'm so encouraged by both Ruel and by Jess. In your handout, we've got this diagram, which is the neat version of this one. Okay, so it's, I think, the inside of the front cover, and that's kind of the blank version, which I included that because we want to. By the end of today, I want you to have started at least trying to fill out that diagram for your own ministry context. So this session, I want it to be interactive, and I'm going to ask, I'm going to open the floor for questions. What I'll do is I'll repeat the question so that it can be recorded. And so I really appreciated some of the great questions that people were asking over the break. But before I do that, let me jump back into the Bible with you for a minute. I was not sure whether I was going to do this, but I think it's helpful. We're going to look in Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11, because what happens is sometimes I get so caught up in Matthew's Gospel that I think it's Matthew's Gospel, and that's one of the 66 books, right? And sometimes when we get out of Matthew's Gospel, we find it hard to see this process continuing. But I think in the book of Acts, we do see the disciples continuing Jesus' process, and Acts chapter 11, verse 19, marks a significant transition point in the history of the church. Up until this point, the gospel has been impacting Jewish people, and the church in Jerusalem was primarily Jewish people. We know that Philip had preached to the Ethiopian. We know that the Apostle Peter had preached to Cornelius, but there weren't necessarily Gentile churches, right? But in Acts chapter 11, verse 19, we see that the church in Antioch is formed, and it's formed around Gentile converts. And so let's just have a look and see what happens. See this same process spelled out. So Acts 11 verse 19 says, "Now those who had been scattered by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed travelled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus and Antioch, spreading the word only among Jews." They were sharing the gospel with people who were culturally similar to them. Does that make sense? They were diaspora Jews, they were people like themselves. But Jesus said, make disciples of all nations. By the command all nations, he's talking about cross-cultural. Now today, if you are living in church culture, anyone outside of church culture is cross-cultural, right? You've got to think about things differently. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began speaking to Greeks also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. And the Lord's hand was with them, and a great number of people believed and turned to the Lord. You've got people from Cyprus and Cyrene suddenly sharing the gospel with people who are Greeks, as in non-Jewish, and some of them have come to faith. So we see that first step happening. News of this reached the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. What do we know about Barnabas from earlier in the book of Acts? We know that his name was Joseph, but he was called Barnabas, which his nickname was Son of Encouragement. Hang on a sec. If this is such a radical step, is the church in Jerusalem sending up the guy, the auditors to kind of check whether this is legit? No, I think they're sending up a guy who is by nature an encourager. They're not thinking this is weird, they're thinking this is good. And we also know that Barnabas, was from Cyprus. So here's some guys from Cyprus who've gone to Antioch, planted a church. The church in Jerusalem wants to encourage them by sending someone who's like them and encouraging them in their ministry. And he says, when he arrived and saw what the grace of God had done, he was glad, and surprisingly, he encouraged them. all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. Evangelism continues, multiplied. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, perhaps Saul wasn't in Tarsus, maybe this was when he was down in Arabia, but he started in Tarsus and went to look for him. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. So evangelism has led to people needing teaching. Barnabas knew that the needs were greater than what he could supply on his own. He went and found somebody who could partner with him in teaching the new believers. And the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. There's a whole story there which we won't go into. And then what happens is some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch and prophesied about the famine, and so they took up a collection and they sent their gift to the elders in Jerusalem. So the Gentile church is supporting the Jewish mother church, who have probably spent lots and lots of resources looking after the new believers and resourcing the expansion of the kingdom, and now their expansion of the church, and they're now in need themselves. And so the church that's been planted is resourcing the mother church. And so they sent this gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul, their two leaders. If you jump ahead then to the end of chapter 12, Acts chapter 12, because there's a bit of a tangent. We get to Acts chapter 12, verse 25. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, that is, when they had finished their time in Jerusalem, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark, whose mother owned the house that they'd met in for prayer when Peter was locked up in prison. And it says now in chapter 13, verse 1, now in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. Hang on a sec. When Barnabas first arrived, there was one teacher, and he'd had to go find Saul to be a second teacher. Now they've got 5 teachers, right? They've multiplied, they've grown, they've developed other people as teachers and prophets in the city, in the church. And interestingly, when you look at who these people are, they are an incredibly diverse population. They are, so Barnabas, who's the Cypriot, Jewish Cypriot. You've got Simeon, called Niger, which is the Latin name for black. So he's probably an African. Could be an African guy of some sort. Lucius of Cyrene. Cyrene is the country of Libya. So again, North Africa. So you've got some African guys as elders in the church. And Manaen, and the word that's been translated in the NIV as had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch is actually, he was the son of Herod's wet nurse. If you know what, so if you were the princess, you didn't breastfeed your own baby, you gave it to somebody else. And so here is Manaen on one breast and Herod on the other breast. You can't get much closer than that, right? He was raised in the royal palace. He was a man of standing. He was a man of wealth and influence. And here he is. He's been developed as a leader in the church. And then you've got Saul, the Pharisee, ex-Pharisee. This is an incredibly diverse leadership team. While they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. And after they'd fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. See this? This is a Gentile church. This is the first cross-cultural challenge that the church has faced. And here they are doing baptize, teach to obey, and go. Here they are doing win, build, send. This process that we have outlined is thoroughly biblical. And it doesn't just depend on one context. It fits every context, I believe. So, how do we actually do it? What I'm going to do is give you two examples of how I have filled in the sheets. The first one is this one, which is my Sydney University one. I didn't include each each name on here because there's just too many to fit on the page. But let me start by saying, when we look at this process, how do we evaluate which which tools do we use? Which programs, which approaches fit? And I'm going to say that the first, that the start over here, and I didn't leave myself enough space, but over here is the community that you're trying to reach. Right? And so the community that you're trying to reach determines which pre-evangelism approaches you take. Yes?
Can you throw the red texture away?
Sure. I can do it in black. It's still illegible. It doesn't matter what colour it is.
Contrast is better.
Yes. So you'll see on this side, I can't think of my left and right at the moment. On this side, it's got the Sydney University campus community. And when I think about Sydney University, my commitment in building a disciple-making movement is that there are 60,000 students on campus. It's the size of a small town, maybe a medium-sized town. And it's a large campus. Geographically, it's a large campus that it's spread over a couple of blocks. You know, it takes a good 15 minutes to walk from one side of campus to the other. And so it's in fact, the university at the moment is going through a $1.5 billion rebuilding program. And they're trying to turn it from kind of this just long continuous blah to try and create 6 or 7 different hubs so that people will congregate and spend time in one location rather than, you know, I used to have a class on one end of campus and have 10 minutes to walk, the 15-minute walk to the other side of campus and for the next hour, and then I'd go back again. It was like I wasn't doing classes that seemed to match with each other. But it's a large campus with multiple meeting points, which means that, you know, when I have my 30 or 50 students around on campus, they don't naturally necessarily run into each other unless they're in class. So 30 or 50 students amongst 60,000 feels like a drop in the ocean. You might feel that way, you know, in your own church. If you're in a small church in a common suburb of Sydney, you might feel like I don't run into people at church except for when I'm at church. It affects what you're doing. It's a prestigious campus. 3 of Australia's last 5 Prime Ministers, so Turnbull and Abbott and John Howard were all Sydney Uni grads. And it's got a very political edge to it. In fact, I could talk to you about the trends and the issues that are happening in politics in New South Wales now based on what I see happening at Sydney Uni. Like what's happening at Sydney Uni now is going to influence the politics of New South Wales and therefore Australia for the next 20 or 30 years. But I'm not here to talk about politics. Private schools. So one of my students does law at Sydney Uni. He said that in his law course, you know, in the dozens of people, scores of people he knows in his law course, there is no one in his law course who either did not go to a selective school or one of the elite private schools. They're a very different animal to your kind of average run-of-the-mill Joe in Sydney. They travel. Sydney Uni students travel. When we're trying to organise stuff over the break, it's like, oh, I'm actually holidaying in Japan right now, or I've gone to, you know, I'm doing my Europe summer, you know, doing my summer thing in Europe. Or it's like, man, when I was at Macquarie, students from Macquarie didn't like they might go to, you know, the Gold Coast, you know, but these guys travel internationally. It affects their worldview, and in fact, Sydney Uni has a big emphasis on encouraging international exchange. They recognise that the cultural boundaries, you know, only being exposed to Sydney culture limits their graduates' future potential, and so they want to send people overseas. So we often lose students for a semester. I've got a student at the moment studying in France, and other ones have been in Italy, and other ones considering going to Canada. So travel is a big deal. Politically active, as I said. A third of the students are international students, the vast majority from mainland China, but we get students for an exchange for a semester from the US, from Canada. It's great. Power to Change is called Power to Change in Canada too, so we get Canadians turning up going, oh, I know who you are, and we're part of you. Lots of students from outside of Sydney metro area, so they live near campus, so much more than Macquarie. You know, I'm contrasting this with other campuses in my head, but at Macquarie, not many students from the country go to Macquarie Uni, but lots of students from, you know, Wagga, Bathurst, Tamworth all come to Sydney Uni. And local students commute, you know, so it takes me an hour and a half to get to campus by bus, and there's lots of students who do the same sort of deal. It means that once they're on campus, they stay, but if they're not in campus for the day, they're not there at all. It affects the way we do things. when I was in the US, every student moved to the town to go to college, and they lived in a dorm, and we would run Bible studies at 9:30 at night because that's when classes were done. Right now I'm trying to run Bible studies at 10 or 11 or 1 p.m. For an hour and trying to fit them between classes. It affects how we do stuff. Only about 3% are evangelical, and that's a statistic for across Sydney. I think with the age distribution of churches that the statistic is probably less than that. We may only have 1% of our university students who are evangelical believers, people who have a genuine relationship with God. Most of our students, 60% of our students don't even have a friend who goes to church. So when you encounter someone for the first time, we're definitely coming at them cold. And it's diverse religious backgrounds. And so what that impacts me as I'm thinking about reaching the campus, because when I'm talking to a student, I can't say, oh, you're just going to reach the average nominal Anglican kid, like in the 1970s when 80% of people had gone to church, grown up going to Sunday school, and they were all in some sort of Protestant church or Catholic church. It's very simple training people. This is how you approach this person because you're going to meet lots and lots of people like that. These days, everyone I meet is different. It's nominal Catholics, it's committed Catholics, it's Muslims, it's Hindus, it's like everybody, Baha'i, Buddhist. Last year I was with Ruel. He had a friend from philosophy class who had grown up in Newtown. He was a white Aussie guy who was one of the leaders of the Buddhist Society. He'd gone through some tough times in high school and decided to become a Buddhist because the meditation had really helped him deal with his suffering, questions about suffering. We were trying to read Soren Kierkegaard together. I was like, this is not something that everybody I meet is different. Makes a real challenge for me as I'm coaching people in how to raise and how to engage with their friends. The one simple approach, there's two ways you can go. One is you can be really specific and try and train everybody to a high degree of how to reach everybody, And in fact, I was having this great conversation before about what do we do if my Mormon friend is trying to convert me while I'm trying to share the gospel with them, And it's like, oh, but they're different to the Catholic friend that I have. It's like, you can try and hit each person, or the approach I tend to prefer, which is like give everybody one simple tool and then help them think about how to adapt it based on the context, the person you're talking with. So that Sydney Uni campus community, that's one way of thinking about it. And so we then engage in these Connect activities you would have heard. So just trying to be really specific to say that we've got O Week. We do quick quizzes. There's thousands of students milling around. We just do quick 3-question quizzes, looking for people who are right at the brink of being interested. We're not engaging in long relationships or long conversations. We're just trying to do the mass, the cold contact stuff. Walking up to people, as I said. We're talking about classmates and school friends. Somebody cautioned me a little while ago, don't be challenging people to invite their friends to church, because who we classify as a friend, like we have a fairly high bar for what it means to be a friend. But thinking about classmates, like I can sit in class with people and they're not necessarily my friends, they're just people I see regularly. In fact, some of my work colleagues, back when I was working as an accountant, I would spend hours sitting in the same room with them, but when I stopped working, I never saw them, It's like they're not really friends. Who I think of a friend as someone I see in multiple contexts. But if I see them in one context, they're just a classmate or a work colleague. We talk about posters, Facebook, Instagram, Easter outreach. And you can see that I've got a list of names there of people who, they're currently students who aren't believers, but our student leaders have, or our Christian students have identified them as friends that they're actively looking to surf a spiritual interest in. And so we're praying that they will say yes to take the next step. Fiona, Glyn, Amy, Michelle, Tim and James are students who are currently we're engaging with the gospel. In fact, Fiona and Glyn are in the wrong category because since I wrote this, they prayed the prayer to receive Christ and they're over in the build category. James is a 4th year guy training to be a Catholic priest. And so I'm meeting with him at the moment and we're reading through Romans together because I didn't know what else to do with him. I was like, I don't have many of those kind of guys, right? But Tim is a highly committed Catholic as well. And anytime I'm trying to do Christianity Explained with him, everything came up with as issues. But we do Knowing God Personally booklets, Christianity Explained, testimonies. I haven't mentioned testimonies, but they're really important. And I included an Easter talk just because I don't want you to think you can't do an evangelistic Sunday service, for example. And then we've got the build category where, as I said before, we're doing large group weekly meetings, small group core groups, one-on-one discipleship, training, and our mid-year conference. I've got some flyers for our mid-year conference coming up in July. If you or anyone you know as a uni student would like to be trained, coming to our mid-year conference is a great opportunity for that. And the summer projects that connected us with Ruel and with Jess are also 2-week training projects. Last December, I led a 2-week project over on the Northern Beaches. Northern Beaches of Sydney is one of the least churched areas in Australia. And people are, and it's also incredibly monocultural. Outside of Dee Why, which has kind of a high islander population, there are some parts of Northern Beaches where it's just like white Aussieville still, and they are really hard to talk to about spiritual things. And so it's like, we're going to take our students there and have them practice on the hardest people possible, so that when they get to campus, they'll think it's easy. None of this, will take them to India where they get to, meet all these students who love talking about spiritual things and pray really easily. It's like, no, we're going to send them to the hardest places. We do also send a team to West Asia and Japan, because there are other places that are really difficult, but we want to train our students in how to share the gospel cross-culturally. And then I've got some other students like Nick and Courtney who are owning their campus, and we run a special leadership small group for them, and we have student leaders meetings. And then at the end here, in the blank one, this is called your product. What we say that we're trying to produce is Christ-centered disciple makers. And when it comes to filling out your own, you want to be as specific in this area as possible. So by that I mean, what is it that you want people to know? What is it that you want people, what biblical convictions do you want them to have? What personal disciplines do you want them to be practicing? What ministry skills do you want them to have? So for example here, and I've just picked a few, we want our students to be having quiet times, QT. Transferable concepts, numbers 1 to 6, are kind of the foundation that we use in follow-up material. We want them to be able to share their testimony. We want them to be able to lead a small group and to disciple somebody one-on-one, and we definitely want them involved in local churches. Right? So what that means is that when I'm looking at this end, how do I engage my campus community? These activities are determined by this, right? But the further I move along the arrow, this determines my curriculum up here. Okay? So when I say that that's what my desired outcome is, that's my ministry's outcome. That's not telling you that's what your ministry's outcome should be. Right? You need to figure out what it looks like to be a fully mature follower of Jesus in your context, someone who makes disciples. I'd encourage you to meet up with some other people in your ministry context and talk explicitly about what that looks like. I've also been asked to give you an example of what this looks like in a local church. And so at the moment I go to Cherrybrook Baptist Church. My pastor is someone who is trying to put this into practice. We are wrestling with it together. We're on a learning process, right? And so what's the Cherrybrook community? Well, there's 18,000 people who live in the postcode for Cherrybrook. The average age is 40. They're about to finish the Norwest Rail Link station, which means that there's lots of development. I mean, driving into here, there's amazing amounts of development here in Riverstone. But our church meets in the largest high school in New South Wales. There's over 2,000 students at Cherrybrook High School. But it's a school where the access has changed over the last few years. There's a lot more concern about, being able to promote Christian activity in the high school. Cherrybrook was a new suburb 30 years ago, but it's now matured, which means that there used to be lots of families with young kids, and there is still a lot of families with high school kids in the suburb because there's a high demand. People move into Cherrybrook to get their kids into Cherrybrook High School. It's a limit. It's one of those schools where you can only get into it if you live in the suburb. There's a lot of, in recent years, there's been a lot of migrants come in from China, Hong Kong, India, and South Africa. I just did this by looking up the census data, right? I know it anecdotally, but I was looking for confirmation. There's 3,700 people who identify as Catholic out of a total population of 9,870 total Christians, but there's 4,500 who identify as having no religion. There's 1,500 Hindus and 1,000 Buddhists. And it's been interesting when we have been doing, it says in the GenNext activities, like an Easter egg hunt. We'll invite people from the neighbourhood to come to an Easter egg hunt on Easter Sunday morning, and we'll put on a free breakfast barbecue. Bacon and egg rolls work really well with Aussies, not so great with Muslims or Hindus. Right? And if you're going to cook them, you can't cook something for them on the same barbecue that you're cooking the bacon and egg rolls. Right? This is what I mean. Like, it's not rocket science in hindsight, but until you understand your community you're trying to reach, it influences what you're going to do. 10% of our population have postgrad degrees. That's incredibly high. And I can't remember, and lots of them are in the executive class and have high mortgages. I can't remember what the mortgage payment was, but there was something like 1,000 people who were paying more than $5,000 a month on a mortgage. So you sit there and go, financial stress. My dad used to do real estate agent and covered some of that area, and he said that one of the greatest reasons for houses being sold was the marriage breakdown, because to be able to service a mortgage like that, you need to have both people working long hours, and the relationships couldn't handle the pressure. So you think about reaching this suburb, right? This is the context we're operating in. You can do the same thing for your own ministry context. And so we focus having guests at the Easter egg hunt, and we do a carols thing, which is not, everybody does that, don't they? But the question is, how do you take them from that to the next step, right? We do mainly music, which is kind of like a preschool thing. That's actually been the most effective thing for us. Mums turning up week after week, but the ladies who run it have done a really good job of connecting with people, building relationships, and moving them through to the point where they're actually believers and coming to church. But we've been trying some other things as well. One of the things we tried a month ago, which wasn't successful, was that we tried a short film festival. So I was telling Mike about this when we were down there. It seemed like a really good idea at the time, one of those things. It's like there's a ministry that's part of Power to Change Globally called Global Short Film Network, and they've got a whole range of short films on there, and there's discussion questions, and so you can just download some, show a 3 to 5 minute film, it's got some discussion questions, show another 3 to 5 minute film, discussion questions, and they're really just designed to surface spiritual conversations. They're not blatantly evangelistic. I mean, one of them, or you can choose some that are, but most of them are just kind of everyday life questions. And I thought, this is really cool. We've got people we can invite. It turned out that 5 families turned up, and they were all from within the church. Nobody in Cherrybrook really likes short films. That's more of maybe a Newtown kind of thing, I didn't understand my community. We tried something, and it didn't connect, right? That's okay. The one way you learn about the community is by trying different things, isn't it? I love a church that does an indoor sports centre. It's like built-in connect, right? We have in the past done Alpha. I'll mention that I've put Alpha in the win category here because that's the way it's been used, but I had a few questions over lunch. What do you think about Alpha? Alpha was designed by Nicky Gumbel originally as a new members class. And so he had people who were coming to Holy Trinity Brompton who were just new to the church, and he wanted to put them through a new members class. And being England at the time, it was like, well, we've got to make sure that they know the gospel, so we'll do 3 sessions on the gospel and then 7 kind of on the foundational teachings of following Jesus in our church context. And so because of that context, I think it really worked well with people who were turning up to church, like people who are open to coming to church, and it's gone globally. It's a really well-presented course. I think with Alpha, though, it's definitely got the Holy Spirit weekend, which has a particular type of teaching on the Holy Spirit, which may or may not fit with your church, right? So when it comes to curriculum, what you teach in your curriculum has to lead towards the outcome that you're trying to achieve. Those of you who are teachers understand this stuff, right? And Alpha, it may or may not fit with that. Christianity Explained is the other one. We do special Sundays. Cherrybrook used to be a church that was very much a seeker service type church, and it's sort of transitioned through. It's been through a few different phases, but we still, as a church, like to do the big events. And events are okay. Like there's a whole debate that goes on at the moment between missional church and attractional church, and the big events. People say the big attractional church stuff doesn't work. I say it does work. If you've got the budget of Hillsong, you can put on an amazing event, right? Attraction works, but the question is, how are you going to use it to do this, right? I'm not saying missional is better than attractional. I'm not saying attractional is better than missional. I'm saying both of them are just two different ways of trying to make disciples. And how you make disciples, that you're making disciples, and what approach works in your context is really something for you to think through. And then we go through, as I said, the build activities, which you'd be familiar with. Sunday services fit as a build activity. If you're a seeker service church, Willow Creek in Chicago was famous for being seeker services. Where do seeker services fit? Sunday service, he said, I remember Bill Hybels saying, if you've got a non-Christian who's thinking about going to church, they're going to think about going to church Sunday morning. So we want to run our Sunday morning services for non-Christians. So his seeker service is actually a connect activity, right? They ran their believers services on Wednesday and Thursday night. They said, if you're already following Jesus, you'll go to church anytime. Like, we'll run a church for Christians on Wednesday and Thursday night. So then you go, okay, here you've got Willow Creek, who's got 20,000 people coming to a church on a weekend. And then you've got another church that, maybe a big Presbyterian church in Chicago that's running 1,000 people at Sunday services. And you go, well, Willow Creek's 20 times the size of the Presbyterian church. I was like, no, Willow Creek is doing 20,000 people at this level, and their Wednesday and Thursday nights is doing this. And the Sunday service at the Presbyterian church is here. Does that make sense? So they're not, by comparing a Sunday service with a Sunday service, they're actually not comparing apples with apples. So let me tell you, it doesn't matter what you do. It matters how you do what you do. It doesn't matter whether it's a small group or a large group. It doesn't matter whether it's attractional or missional. It's about what fits best in your context to move people through this process. And when you think about things in this framework, it helps you evaluate, have I got something that fits in this box? Training, our church is pretty weak on training. I love the fact that you have these conferences. For me, this is a training conference. I'm not teaching you the Bible so much. The first session was more of a Bible talk, but this is more about trying to help you think about how do you do ministry. And then leaders' meetings. And so then our church has, I don't think we've really nailed it yet in terms of what we think a mature Christian looks like. So this is a work in progress. And let me encourage you, it can be a work in progress for your ministry situation as well. Just finally, as another example, before we break up into something, to do something, the 1950s suburban church. Now, this is a bit of a myth in my head, right? So I'm just making up something that I've labelled 1950s suburban church, because I was born in 1970. So some of you think that's a long time ago, some of you think that wasn't that long ago. But this is just what I remember, right? This is what I remember hearing as I was growing up in my assembly in Epping. And so Epping and Eastwood were like, there was UK or European descent was the population, rapidly expanding into Parramatta and Epping, and university was available to some World War II vets. Most workers had a high school education. Women were starting to be independent. There were a few motor vehicles. People holidayed. Manly used to be a holiday destination before it was the Central Coast, or the Blue Mountains. Going up to Lura for a holiday. 80% church attendance, primarily within Catholic, Anglican, nonconformist churches. So there's, kind of a quick snapshot. How did we connect? How did the church connect with people? It was relationships in the local neighbourhood. Because people didn't have cars, they were much more connected to their own local suburb. And so family members, neighbours. I remember the story. Somebody told me that they became a Christian because the local assembly sent around a flatbed truck every Sunday afternoon, late in the afternoon, with a loud hailer, inviting people to come to the gospel meeting. Right? And they would pick up people and get on the back of the flatbed truck, and they would drive them into the church. And there's all these non-Christians turning up at church and to the gospel meeting. Sunday morning was for the believers. Sunday night was for the gospel meeting. And I remember in the 1970s just being in the tail end of what do we do with the Sunday night now that we've been preaching the gospel, but there's no non-Christians turning up. It's all just Christian. Oh, let's just turn it into a youth service, right? It became a whole thing. If you go back and read the newspapers in the 1950s, the Monday newspaper would have a report of what was preached in the cathedral on Sunday. You want to talk about connect activities? The pre-evangelism was happening. Can you imagine that happening these days? It's like just a totally different world. Billy Graham Crusade came through in 1959. It was 1957 before people had TVs. So there was no, I'm going to sit home and watch, Sunday night TV. Why would you go to the gospel meeting? Because there was nothing else to do. Like Sunday night, it was just hang out. I can either sit at home with my wife or I can go out. It's like, well, let's go out, jump on the flatbed truck and we'll go, These days, people have just got so much going on, and, most of our teenagers are sitting there like this, staring at the screen, It's like, why would they? I don't want to talk to the person in the next room. I mean, I sit in the car now with my teenagers and I've got my music on the radio and they've both got headphones on listening to their music. We don't even listen to the same thing in the car anymore. Not saying it's wrong. I'm just glad I don't have to listen to their music. And I the big regional gatherings. I love the fact that there are still these conferences that happen within the assembly tradition, because it's not that common amongst other denominations. Katoomba is one of the big ones that still challenges people or invites people. And training was done at Emmaus Bible School. That wasn't about, people didn't get qualifications, didn't get formally recognised qualifications. That was a big debate within Emmaus about, do we go for accredited degrees or not? And then the Ascent, where elders were all supposed to do stuff. So, and then mature Christians, people who knew the Bible. I actually think people who understood dispensational theology was a big deal back then, right? These days, I'm not sure. I meet people from across the assemblies. One of the questions I have in my head, and no, don't need to answer this now, but do you need to be dispensational to be breatho? I'm not going to start that debate, right? But back then, it would have been a no-brainer. People who contributed, a mature Christian was a believer who contributed to open worship and served in the church and gives faithfully to mission and so on. So I'm just trying to push you a little bit. Does that make sense? This is giving you some different ideas. I want to give you about 5 or 10 minutes. I want you to find somebody who is in a ministry context similar to you. If you're here from the same assembly, same church, or thinking about doing ministry in the same context, I want you to get together with that person so you can actually get up and move around. I'll give you 5 or 10 minutes, and then just start asking or answering the questions. Fill in, what is it that's... Ignore the little black line on the side. That's got a lot more detail than you need. That's from the shift course. But just fill in some questions about who is it that we're trying to engage with and what sort of activities are we doing. And even maybe, if you get to it, what's the product at the end? And let me tell you that I did this down at Smithton, and one of the ladies there, students, is working in an assembly, and when she was doing this, she was like, oh, you know what, I think we're doing some of this and we're some of this, and we're doing some of this, but we've got nothing up here. It's okay to say that, right? I think, in fact, some of the assemblies who are still very faithful in meeting, it's what happens as the assembly shrinks is that they focus on, all we do is Sunday morning. Now, is an assembly that only meets on a Sunday morning where people are only getting together for breaking of bread, is that really what God's called them to do? They're saying, we're being faithful to what God has called us to do. I'm like, is that really being faithful to what God's called us to do? So, but reality is our friend. Let's, give you 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how conversations go, find someone, have a chat, start filling it out for your own context.
I think this is going to be too big.
It could be. Split it in half.
Split it in half.
Split it in half and compare answers.
Yeah. So,
Or thirds. Like, seriously, 3 people each. Move.
three people each. Come and sit down. I'll go and sit with you.
Let me apologise. Let me apologise if I was speaking too quickly.
We didn't know you heard
Yeah, let me apologise if I've been speaking too quickly.
I've been only just 3 months.
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm learning, studying English.
that's right.
Yes.
And I am sorry that I have not been
Never
speaking.
mind, never mind.
But, yeah.
Yes.
But if you have any questions,
Sorry, actually, I didn't understand.
where are you from? Where are you?
I'm Korean.
Yeah?
Yes, Korean.
Whereabouts in Korea? Which city?
I live in Seoul, nearby South Korea. Yes.
Uh-huh. I visited,
Have you ever been?
I've got a mental blank on the name. No, I can't remember. I visited Korea 3 years ago. 3 years ago, and spent at Kim Young University. There was a Kim Young. I need to look it up. I'm sorry, I haven't. I'm not thinking about Korea. I was thinking about other places. I can't remember the city. It was down south on the way to Busan, but not. No, not Busan. Up north, up above Busan, below Seoul. But anyway. No, that doesn't ring a bell. I'll look it up. I will look it up and let you know. Are you all Korean? Yeah? And here for English program? Sorry? Yeah, Glow? Yeah. The Cross Connect. Yeah. Crosswalk, yeah. Wow, very good. He knows all the answers.
Can you he graduated Cross Connect in Tasmania, right?
Yes. I was in Smithton. Yeah. A month ago. No, 3 weeks ago. Valerie. Yeah. So Valerie, I taught Valerie this. Yeah. Sorry? I visited as teacher, yeah.
But my brother is there.
Oh, really? Your brother is?
Jeremy?
Yeah.
Jeremy is my brother.
Ah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
We are going to the Tasmania next year.
Yes.
Will you go there next year?
They have asked me to come. I do not have date yet. Like, I have not booked it, but yes, I plan to go. Yeah. And teach this.
I will save this paper.
Yes. So, in Korea, what is the community like you are trying to reach? Like in Korea, community, lots of Koreans think the same, right? So one easy thing here is that everybody is the same. Not when I was at university there, visited the university, very few international students compared to Australia. Maybe Chinese, Indian, Pakistan, but maybe 1,000 out of 30,000. But 29,000 Korean students, and many think the same, right? But maybe only 20% are Christian, go to church. So that thinks lots of people who are the same, but lots of people who maybe know about church but don't go to church. So how do we find people who are interested in learning about Jesus? Not just talking church, but how do we find people who are wanting to learn about Jesus? Can you repeat that? Yeah, thank you for translating. I need a translator. I feel very, very foolish because I only speak one language, English, and I speak very bad English. So any one of you who learns more than one language, you are much smarter than me. So, yes. And then, what is the person what does a Christian who is doing everything they should be, what do they look like? What does somebody look like who knows how to help these people? So, they know how to read the Bible. They know how to pray. They know how to share the gospel. They know what else do they need to know? How much of the Bible do they need to know? There's some questions to think about. Thank you for letting me borrow that.
Yes, I understand 50%.
That's better.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. You know the good thing about this exercise? It's much more interesting listening to each other than it is to listening to me. And you could spend a long time talking about this stuff, right? And I would encourage you to continue this exercise after we finish today. I don't want to drag it out because you can do this conversation on your own time, and I can go home and hang out with my daughter. But while she's got her headphones on, let me tell you just one thing one extended idea that may be helpful for you. I've got two things I want to say, but one extended idea is that don't be too concerned about trying to fit everything into one of these arrows. So let me give you the explanation. So one of our youth leaders actually did up an arrow like this for their junior high group, and then a separate arrow for their senior high group, and another arrow for their young adults group in their church. Because they actually ran different programs based on, and each community person was different, right? Each community they were trying to reach was different. If you're trying to reach, when I was in Smithton and I was talking to Kelly from Cambodia, and I asked her to do up this diagram, and she's like, I'm trying to think about my Christian school. We've got students who are coming, and I was like, well, why are the parents sending their kids to this Christian school if they're not Christians? And she's like, well, they're valuing education and all these different things. And I was like, and they want a school that cares about their children. I was like, great, so you can write down some values over here. That when you're engaging in your activities, you don't want to violate those values, right? You actually want to piggyback on them. And so then she started drawing in programs, but I realized that she had some primary school kids that she's working with who have one set of programs, but really when you're talking about primary school kids, often you're really thinking about how do I reach their parents. So she had one arrow for the kids and another arrow for the parents. You might have an arrow for a men's ministry, another arrow for a women's ministry. So you can take your broader community here, but actually subdivide it based on how you can get a stream going through. Okay? So hopefully, if you run one simple arrow that actually generates momentum, then you can start launching other arrows. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is that how does leadership fit with this? So when I'm thinking about everybody is supposed to make disciples. And one of the challenges we had, one of the reasons why I think the church, particularly the assembly movement, lost momentum over the last 50 years is because of a lack of leadership. When I was in Smithton, I said to the guys in Smithton, why did Glow place a training centre in Smithton of all places? Like, you know, it's an hour from the edge of the world. Literally, I went there, took photos. It's on my Facebook page, you can look it up. And they said, because 35 years ago when they started the training centre, there were 50 churches in the north part of Tasmania that all had 50 brethren assemblies that all had 200 plus members. There's now 5 that have more than 50. They've gone from a brethren population of over 10,000 to just a few hundred. I think we felt some of that in Sydney. The question is why? It's because what we were doing in the program in the 1950s church stopped working. We had a whole bunch of people who'd been trained to do ministry in a particular way. Let's send around the flatbed truck. But it stopped working. And we had nobody. I think the job of a leader is to step back from the actual practice and think about, how do I tweak this? How do I change this? How do I adapt this for the new context? Right? I don't expect everybody here to be thinking strategically about, how do I refine what we're doing as a church? Some of you just need to learn how to share the 4 spiritual laws or share the Christianity Explained, right? It's somebody else's job to figure out what's the best approach. But I think within our leadership in our assemblies, we need people who step back from the actual doing and think about the how it works, right? And I actually think there's a gift of leadership that separates. This is not a job just for the elders to do. Everybody makes disciples. But there are leaders within our assemblies who are trusted with the responsibility of making sure that the process keeps working, even if the context we operate in changes. That's where I'm going to finish. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the challenge of the Great Commission. Bill Bright called it the greatest challenge ever given, and it's been accompanied by the greatest promise ever made, which is that you will be with us always to the very end of the age. we think about the challenge of making disciples of all nations, and as overwhelmed, perhaps, as we feel at the complexity of trying to figure out how to do that in our current context, we look forward with anticipation to the vision, that great vision in Revelation, where there are people from every tribe and language and tongue and nation who are gathered before the throne, worshipping the King, and we see the Great Commission fulfilled. Help us to move forward in faith, trusting that as we put ourselves at your disposal, that you will use us to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. In Jesus' name, amen.